Hey, what's up guys? So in the last couple of videos, we were able to create our CRUD operation endpoints, and in this video, I want us to handle authentication and authorization. So this video will be divided into several sections, and in the first section, we will talk about creating a user model. So the first thing we will do is to create a user model. Once we have a user model, we'll be able to use that model to create new users. So basically we'll be registering the users. So we will create an endpoint to handle signup, which is registering new users. When registering the user, this is where we expect the user to also create a password, right? So when we are creating this endpoint, we will also talk about hashing the password. So we will hash the password so that it can be stored securely on our database. Okay. Once we have a user in the database, we'll be able to sign in the users. So we'll create an endpoint to sign in the user, and this is where we'll also talk about JWT, standing for JSON Web Tokens, to authenticate the users. And then after this, we'll be able to protect our endpoints. So right here, we'll protect our APIs, and we will talk about middleware function in this section. Okay, so we'll create our own middleware and use that middleware to protect our CRUD operations endpoints. So basically this endpoint and this endpoint will be public. Okay, so these two endpoints so these two endpoints will be public, and this one will also be public. Anyone can access the sign up and the sign in, but our CRUD operation endpoints will now be private after we protect them using a middleware function. So when protecting our endpoints, we'll also talk about authorization. So there is a difference between authentication and authorization. So this video will basically have 4 sections, and these are the sections. We'll create a user model, we will handle a sign up, we handle sign in, and then we'll protect our APIs. So let's start by creating a user model. I will remove these notes because I don't need them. So to create a user model, we have a models folder which we created earlier in this series. So in this particular folder is where we'll add a new file called user.js, and this is where we will create our user model. So the first thing that we need is to import mongoose. So right here I'll say const mongoose will be equal to require mongoose, and then we'll start by creating a user schema. So const user schema will be equal to new mongoose dot schema. So this is an object coming from this schema class available in our mongoose module. So remember, we said before that a schema basically represents the structure of our documents. It provides the shape for our documents. So right here we will invoke this one, and we should include an object here with properties of our user. So the first thing we need for our user is a name, and then we can include different options here. The first thing is that the type of the name should be a string. It should be required, so we set required to true. We can set a min length and a max length. So min length of 3, a max length of 30. And then the next thing is that we will need an email, and for an email it should be a string. So type of string, it should also be required, so we set required to true. And next thing is that we can set a min length for the email. Min length, we can set it to be 3. We can set a max length also, max length of 200 characters. And then the email should also be unique, so we should not register a user with an email that already exists in the database. So unique should be true. And when I save this, the code will be auto formatted by Prettier. Okay, now the last thing that we need here is the password, name, email, and password. So we should have a password. The password is of type string. It should be required, so we set required to true. And then we can set a min length to be of 3 or rather 6. We need someone to set a strong password, so a min length of 6 and a max length of about 1000 characters, because we'll be hashing the password. If you enter a password which have a plain text of 6 and we hash that password, it will have a lot of characters. Okay, I can set a max length of 1024 characters. So right now we have a schema. Now let's create a model which we will use to create our new users. So right here we'll say a const user. Remember, now this is a class, that's why it starts with a capital letter here. Will be equal to mongoose.model, and then the first parameter is the name of our collection in the database. Okay, so we want the name of our collection to be users. So right here we usually use user in singular form, and this will be converted to plural in small caps. So this one will be users. Okay, and then the second parameter here is our user schema, so just say user schema. And now we have a user model which we can use to create new users using a name, email, and password. And then we need to export this user model so that we can use it on other files. Okay, so right here let's just export our user model this way: exports.user, and we set this one to user. So I'll spell this one correctly: exports.user, and we set it to user. So this section is done. In the next section we'll see how we can use this user model to create a new user. Okay, now in this section I want us to make use of our user model to register a new user, and to do that we'll create a new endpoint where we can register a new user. Okay, so I'll come to the routes folder here, and then I'll create a new file, and I'll call this one signUp.js. So in this file I want us to do several things. The first thing that we will do is that we will validate the incoming data from the client using Joy, and then we will check if a user already exists or not. Okay, so does the user exist? We'll check if a user exists. If they does not exist, we will create a new user. So right here we'll create a new user. After creating a new user, we want to take the password and hash that password. Okay, so right here we will do hashing of the password, hash password. And lastly we will save the user after we have hashed the password. So right here we will save the user. And before we continue, when hashing the password, we will use a popular library called bcrypt. So this is the library that we will need to hash the password, and we need to install it. So right here, open the terminal and run this command, npm I bcrypt, and this will install bcrypt in our application. But because I have already installed bcrypt, I won't run this command, but for you, you can run this command as we proceed. So I'll just cancel this terminal, but make sure you have installed bcrypt. Now let's start by validating the incoming data using joy. So the first thing that we will do is to, of course, import joy to this file. So I'll say const joy will be equal to require joy. We will need to use express. So right here, I'll say const express will be equal to require express. And with express, we can create a mini app. So right here, I'll say const router will be equal to express dot router. So this router will act as a mini app, and we can later use it on our index.js file to integrate it with our main app. Okay, let's now create an endpoint here, and this will be a post endpoint. It will be handling post requests because we are creating a new resource. Okay, and we'll use our mini app here. So router.post, the first parameter is the path, and I'll use the root as the path here. And the second parameter will be an async function, which is also a callback function, which have access to request and response. This is also an arrow function, and we can do something in here. And the first thing that we will do is to create a schema, which is a joy schema, and use that schema to validate the inputs which we are getting from the client. So right here, I'll create a schema. We set this schema to be equal to joy.object. We invoke this method and pass the properties which we are getting from the client in here. And earlier we created a schema using Mongoose in our user file here, and we had 3 properties: name, email, and password. So right here we will have a property called name, and then we can use joy to validate name. So joy.string, we invoke this one, meaning that this is a string. We want it to have a mean length of 3, so we attach the mean method here and pass 3 in here. And also we want it to have a max length of 30 characters. We tap a max method, pass 30. We want it to be required, so we tap the required method. The next thing is the email. We want it to be a string, so joy.string. I invoke this method. I want it to have a mean of 3. And if you want to know more about joy, you can check the episode where we talked more about joy. So right here, I'm just rushing through. Okay, max length of 200, and this is an email, so we tap a method here, email. So this will validate whether the email input is an email, and then we want it to be required. Finally, we have the password. For the password, we want it to be a string. We want it to have a mean of 6. We want it to have a max of 200 characters. And also we want it to be required. Now note that this password, we are getting it as a plain text, and that's why we have a max of 200 characters. Later on, we will hash the password using bcrypt, and it will be much longer than 200 characters. And that's why in our user here, where we were creating our user model, we performed a mongoose validation, and the password was much way longer. Okay, now let's come back here to our signUp.js, and we have now created a schema using Joy. Now let's use this schema to validate our inputs, and how we do that is by simply calling the validate method. So schema.validate, and then we invoke it. We get our inputs from request.body, and this will validate those inputs. The response is the value and the error. So if there is an error, the error object will be there, but if there is no error, the error object will be undefined. So how we can get this error object is by destructuring it from the object that we'll be getting here. So we can just say const, we destructure the error from an object containing error and value. We only want the error. We get the error and store it in a constant. Now we can check whether this error exists or not. If it exists, we want to tell the client that an error exists and you should make some changes. So right here, I'll say if error. If this exists, we will return a message to the client, and this process will terminate the other operations in this particular route. Okay, so right here we will say res.status, and the status code for this one is 400, meaning that this is a client error, and then we send a message to the client. Earlier when we were talking about Joy, I showed you how we can access the message. So the message is available in the error object, and then the error object have a property called details. So right here we can tap details, and this details is an array containing errors. We will get the first error using 0 here. Okay, so this will get our first object, and then we get the message for that object this way, just like that. Now if this error exists, we will send the error message to the client. So the first thing we have done is validate our data using Joy. Now let's check if a user exists. So now I'll scroll right here, and we will use our user model to check if the user exists. So we need to import it at the top here. We need to destructure it from the exports object. So right here we'll say const, we destructure our user from the exports object, and we get this one from our models. So we'll move one level up, access the models folder, and then access the user module, which is our model. Now we are getting this user model in this particular file. Now we can use it to check whether a user exists or not. And how we will do that, we will use the method called findOne, which is available in our model, user.findOne, and we can filter using the email. So right here we can invoke this function and then pass an object to filter the users which we are getting from the database using the email. And since the email is unique, it should tell us whether this user is already registered or not. So right here we'll say email to be equal to request.body.email. And now this request.body.email is the email that we are getting from the client, and we can store this user on a variable. So right here, this process is an async action. It will return a promise, so we can await it and store the response, which is our user, on a variable here. So to create a variable in JavaScript, we use let. So let user be equal to await user.findOne, and we filter the user using the email. Now the reason I have used a variable is because I'll need to reuse this user later. Now we can perform an if statement here. If user is true, that means that this user already exists. If this is null or undefined, that means that the user does not exist. Okay, so if user, we return a message to the client, rs.status. So we include a status code of 400, meaning that this is a client error and not a server error. .send, we include a custom message here. So user with that email already exists. If there is no user with that given email, we now want to create the user. So now we have checked if a user already exists. Now we want to create a new user. But before we continue, you'll see that this is an async action and errors may occur. So we need to wrap this inside a try and catch block. So what I'll do here is to include try and then move the whole of this code in here. And then we need to call catch here to catch any errors. We have access to error object, and then we can do something in here like send the error to the client or log it to the console. So I'll come to my to-do.js file and I'll copy this from this file. So I'll come back to the signUp file and paste it here. So what is happening is that if there is an error when performing this action, we will send a status code of 500, meaning that this is a server error, and we include the error message, and also we can log that error to the console. So now I'll come to our try block and continue to perform more async action like saving the user to the database and so on. So the first thing that we need to do is to get these properties from the request.body. So I'll just destructure them. I'll say const, we destructure name, email, and also we destructure the password. And we are getting this from request.body. Now that we have these ones, we can use them to create a new user, and how we do that is by using our model. So our model is a class, and we can use it as a constructor by including the new keyword. So we can say new user, and when we invoke this one, now this is a constructor for creating a new user. We pass in an object with these properties: name, email, and password, and this will come from request.body. Okay, so what we'll get from this is an object, which is our document or our user. So we can set our user, which was a variable, so we can reassign it to be equal to this particular user. Okay, now this is our new user. Now at this point we have created a user using our model. Okay, now the next step that we need to do is to take the password and hash it. So we are at this point, we have created a user. Now let's hash the password. To hash the password, we need to use our library, which is bcrypt. So let's import it just right here. I'll say const bcrypt will be equal to require bcrypt, just like that. And now we can use bcrypt to hash the password. The first thing that we will do is to generate something we call assault, and assault is a string of characters, random string of characters that helps to make our password unique. Right here I'll say const salt will be equal to we await, this is an async action, await bcrypt, and then we call this method gen salt, like generate salt. And right here what we pass in here is the number of characters that we want our string to have, and the default is 10, and that is what we are going to use. So right here I'll just pass 10. Our salt will have 10 characters. Now the next step is to hash the password, and we use bcrypt.hash method. So right here I'll say bcrypt dot hash. The first parameter is the password that we want to hash, and this is our user object, and it has a property called password. So we can access that property just like this, user.password, and then we pass the second parameter as this salt, and this is an async action, so we can await it and set our user.password to be equal to this hashed password. So what will be returned here is a long string of characters, which is our hashed password. So we can change user.password to be our hashed password. Okay. The next step is to save the user to the database. So this is simple. We will take our user object, which have name, email, and the hashed password. So we'll say user.save, just like that. But this is an async action, so we can await it. So right now we'll not be sending anything to the client. What we'll be sending is just a simple message that the user have been created. Later on we'll come back to this and logging the user once they register. So we'll be sending back a token with user details to the client. Okay, so right here what I can say is res.send and just a message user created, just like that. And now we have completed our steps. We have validated the data using Joy. We have checked if the user exists or not. If they does not exist, we have created a new user. After creating the user, we get the password and hash it, and then save the user to the database. And then what we are sending back is just a message that this user have been created. But later on, we'll be sending back a token which will contain our user details. Okay. So the next step we need to do is to export this module. So just right here we need to export it. So module dot export, and what we will export is our router, and the router is a mini app which we created using Express, and this mini app will give us access to our endpoint. So right here I'll just delete all these notes so that we can have a clean file here, and then if I save this file, it will be auto formatted by Prettier, so my code becomes more readable. And we need to import this module to index.js. So what we will do is that we need to import signUp module, just like this. Now we have access to this signUp, and then the next step is to use app.use, because now our router, which is the mini app, acts as a middleware, and we pass in the path which we want to access our endpoint, and then we include our import, which is signUp, this one. So now we can test this using Postman. So what we'll do is that I'll come to Postman, I click on a new tab here, and what we want to do is to perform a post request. Okay, so our endpoint is using post to create a new resource, which is our user. So right here we'll change this to post, and then right here we access our endpoint, which will be available in http :/localhost 5000, and then a slash, we access it through API stroke signup. And then we need to come to the body of the request. We select row, we include this as a JSON object. So right here we can enter the properties. The first one is the name, and the name should be not less than 3. So right here I'll say Chaoo. Then we get an email here. The email should be a valid email, so Chaoo at gmail.com, and then we include a password, and the password, I'll just include a test password which should not be less than 6 characters. So test 987. So this is the user which we want to create. Let's make sure that our server is running, and it's running. Now let me send this request. So if I send, we should get a message of user was created. Send. So I am getting an error. Our request is hanging, and this is a joy error, unhandled promise rejection, type error, joy.string is not a function. So let me check on this. I'll come back to my text editor and come to sign up, and I think this is the error. Email, we include a minimum of 3 instead of this should be required. So make sure this is required, this is correct. I'll wait for this to restart. Now I'll send it again, and user created. Now perfect, we don't have any error, and the user should be created. So if I go to MongoDB and check for the user, I should see a new collection of users with these details. Now to test this, whether the user was created or not, we can test it, and it should give us an error of user already exists, okay, because we are sending the same email. So I'll send this one again just to check whether our validation works. I'll send. User with that email already exists, so validation is working. We can try to send an invalid email without an @ here and see if the email validation works. I'll send. Email must be a valid email. Perfect. So joy validation is working. Now let's check if the user was actually created. So I'll come to MongoDB, and then right here I'll need to refresh this page, because right now we only have to do correction, we don't have users correction. I'll come here and click refresh. And now you can see that a new correction was added of users. If I click on users collection, we should have at least one document, and this is the document where we created a new user with this name. This is the email, and then you can see our password is hashed. It is not the plain text password that we entered, and it is a very long string. Okay, now in the next section we'll see how we can create an endpoint to handle sign in, and we'll see how we can compare this password with the password that we will be getting from the client. So now we have already created an endpoint to register new users, and in this section I want us to create another endpoint to now sign in the users. So in our routes folder here, I'll add a new file called signIn, just like that, and I include .js. Now in this file we are going to do several things. The first thing is that we will use Joy to validate the inputs, and then if the inputs are valid, we will get our user from the database, and what we will be doing there is checking whether the user exists. Okay, so does the user exist? And then if the user exists, we will validate the password using bcrypt. So we have a method called compare in bcrypt, which will help us to compare the plaintext password and the hashed password which is available in the database. So right here we will validate password. After validating the password, we will then generate a JSON web token, JWT. Okay, we'll generate a token and then send it to the client. Send to client, and by sending the token to the client, it simply means that the client is now logged in. This is what we'll be doing in this particular section or this particular file. So first things first, let's import all the dependencies we need. So I'll come here to sign up, and we need to import Joy, Bcrypt, Express, and also our user model. We'll also create a mini app which will help us to create our endpoint, and we'll also import JWT in our sign-in file. So right here, I'll just copy all this and then come back here and paste it. So now we are importing all this, and then we'll also need to import JWT. And what you need to do first is to install a JSON Web Token module. So at our terminal here, you need to run this command npm I JSON Web Token to install this module. And I have already done this, so I won't be repeating it. So make sure you install JSON Web Token. I'll just close this one, and then I'll import JSON Web Token just like this. So const JWT, which is a shortcut for JSON Web Token, and we require JSON Web Token just like that. Now we'll be able to use JWT in this file. The first thing we will do is to validate our data using Joy. I'll create a new endpoint, so router.post, and then the first parameter is the path, and the second parameter is an async function, which is also our callback function. And we have access to request and response, and this will be an arrow function. So by now, I expect that you are used to this. Now in here, we can create a schema and return an error to the client. So instead of doing everything from scratch, I'll come to sign up and I'll copy all this, where we are creating a schema and sending an error to the client. So I'll copy that and paste it here. But when signing in, we don't need a name, we only need an email and a password. And since we are not saving this data to the database, our Mongoose schema won't complain that we don't have a name, so don't worry about that. So now we are validating the email and password using Joy. Now let's check whether the user exists or not. And how we do that is by simply using this line of code. So I'll copy all this again, come back to sign in, and I'll use a try and catch block just as we did in sign up. So I'll say try and paste this one in here. Now the difference between this check and the one that we had in sign up is that here we want a user to exist. Okay, we want a user to be in the database before we allow them to the system. But in sign up, we don't want a user in the database. We want a different kind of a user to be registered. Okay, so we won't be returning this message, we are getting a user. If a user does not exist, okay, we want to send an error. We want to tell the client that, oops, this user does not exist and you need to register this user. Okay, so right here we'll send a different kind of message, maybe user with a given email does not exist. Or you can use a different kind of a message which is more vague. Okay, the person signing in should be aware whether they are using the correct credentials or not. So you can send a vague message here like invalid email or password. So we don't want to specify which field is wrong. They should figure out that by themselves. The next thing, if this user exists, we will move on to validating the password, and we will use Bcrypt for this. And right here, we should have a catch method which have access to error, and we display the message right here. So I'll just come to sign up, scroll at the very bottom and copy this, come back to sign in and include these messages here. Now let's use Bcrypt to compare the password. We have a method called compare, which is in our Bcrypt module. So Bcrypt.compare, and this method will accept the first parameter as our plain text password, which we are getting directly from the client. So right here I'll say request dot body dot password, and then the second parameter is the password which already exists in the database in user dot password. Now this is an async action which will return a promise. We can await it and store the results in a constant. So maybe I can say const valid password, and this is const and should be equal to await bcrypt. This is the password you are getting as plain text, and this is the password that is available in our database. Now this valid password should be either true or false. So if this password is correct, this will be true. If it's wrong, this will be false. Now we can perform another if statement. So I'll minimize this one so that we get an extra space here. And we should say if we use a not operator, valid password. If this password is not valid, what we want to do is to send an error to the client, and we will send this exact message: invalid email or password. We just don't want to specify which is which. Okay, so I can just paste this one here, and if I save, Prettier should auto format this file for me, and it doesn't, meaning that we have an issue. This one I'll save, and there we go. Now which point are we at? When I come here, we have used joy, we have checked whether the user exists, we have checked whether the password is valid. Now we should simply log in the client by generating a token and sending it to the client. So let me include some spacing for this one for much better readability. So right here we should generate a token, and we will be using JWT. We have already imported it at the top. This is how we imported JSON Web Token. Now we can use this JWT to create a new token. How we create a new token is by using a method available in JWT called sign. And this sign accepts the first parameter as the payload. Okay, and this is the data that we may want our token to have at the payload, and I want the token to have a UID, so I'll include an ID here, and this will be coming from user._ID. When we create a new user using our signup endpoint, an ID was auto-generated by MongoDB, and this is now the ID of that user. And then we will want the name of this user, which will be available in user.name. And remember that this user object is the one that we got from this line of code. Find one, and we used email to filter that user. Okay, so this is name, and then I want an email to be user.email, but we don't want to send the password to the client, so we'll only include the name, email, and the ID. So this is the first parameter, which is the payload of our token. And then the second parameter should be a secret key, which makes our token to be more secure. And we should store this secret key in an environment variable. So earlier we talked about environment variables, and we store them in a .env file. So I'll come to the .env file and add another environment variable just right here. And I'll call this one secret_key. And you can set this one to be a string of characters, any string of characters, and we should not actually include the quotes. So this can be anything, and then we can read this secret key from our environment variable using the global object, which is process. So right here I will store our secret key in a constant. So I'll say secret will be equal to, we use our global object process which have access to .env, and we can read our environment variable right here. So it should be the same. I'll just copy this secret key and then come to sign in and paste it here. Now we have our secret key available in this constant, and that is the second parameter that we should pass here. Now we are using a sign method which is available in JWT. The first parameter is the payload. The second parameter is a secret key which we are storing in an environment variable, which should be more secure. So our .env file should never be available in GitHub or public place. It should only be available in the server. And what we will get from this is a JWT token. So we can store the response in a constant. So const token will be equal to this. And then the next step is to send this token to the client. So res.send and token. So we are sending the token to the client, and that means that now the user have signed in, because we will use this token to secure the routes, to allow access to certain features and deny access to certain features. Now the next thing that we need to do is to simply export this endpoint, just like this. I'll come at the bottom here, say module dot exports will be equal to our mini app, which is router. And this is how we simply sign in a user. Okay, now I'll save this file to auto format everything and come back here at the top and delete these notes now that we are done with them. The next thing is that we need to be able to read this file, and we will do that by going to our index.js file, and then I'll just duplicate this line and include sign in. By now you know what this one means. And then right here is sign in, and we should import it right here. I'll just duplicate this, change this one to sign in and this one to sign in. Now we should be able to sign in a user using this endpoint. Now let's go to Postman and test our endpoint. I'll come back to Postman here and change the path here from sign up to sign in. So sign in, and then the body of the request should have only an email and a password, and this should be a valid email which already exists in the database. And then the password is that one. And now our response should be a JSON web token. So I'll send this, and yeah, perfect. We are getting a very long string here, which is our JWT, and you can see it have 3 sections. I'll copy it. In my web here, I'll go to JSON web token website, which is jwt.io, and I'll scroll at the bottom, and what I'll do is to decode this token. So I'll select all this and delete, and then paste the token which I copied from Postman. And now when you come here, the first section of our token in red is the header, which contains the type of algorithm that was used. And then the second section is the payload, and you can see the payload. Now we have an ID of the user, we have a name and an email. So perfect. And then the other is a timestamp of when this token was generated. And finally we have a signature, which makes our token to be more secure. And this came from our header, our payload, and also our secret key. So we are now signing in the user, and we can use this token on the front end to allow access to certain features and so on and so forth. And we can decode the token to read this data to know the currently logged in user. Now that is how we handle sign in. And I want us, when we register a user, we also sign them in automatically. And how we can do that is to simply generate a token and send it to the client once we save the user to the database. So this way, I'll just come to sign in and I'll copy the last 3 lines right here where we have a secret key. We generate the token and send the token to the client. So I'll copy this, come back to sign up and paste it just right here. And then I'll come back to sign in, scroll at the very top, and I'll copy this module where we are importing it, JSON Web Token, come back here and also import it right here. Now, when we sign up a user, we should save the user to the database and also generate a token. And this user here is available where we were finding a user by email right here. So we should get their ID, name, and email. So I'll come back to Postman and test whether we will get a token when registering a user. So right here, I'll change this one to sign up. And then when signing up, we should have a name. And right now, I can include the full name here, Chaoo Charles. And then for the email, we should send a different email. So I'll change the email to 2 and include a comma. Now this is the body of the request. This is the endpoint and it's a post request. Now we should get a token back and the user should be saved to the database. I will send, and we are getting back a token. When I copy this, go to JWT, select this, delete, and paste this one. You'll see now we are getting Chaoo Charles at our payload and Chaoo 2 as the email. So we are now signing in the user by generating a token and sending it to the client. And when I come to database and refresh, we should have this user available in the database. So I will come and find the refresh button right here. Refresh. And in our users, we now have 2 users. And this is the one that we just created. Now that's it for this section. In the next section, we will see how we can protect our endpoints. So far, we can register a user and also we can sign in the users. Now in this section, I want us to protect our to-dos APIs or endpoints so that a user may not be able to delete a to-do or create a new to-do and perform other operations if they are not logged in. So how we will do that is by using a middleware function. So I'll come at the root of the application here and create a new folder, and I'll call this folder middleware. So this is where we will store all our middleware function, and in this case we want to create a middleware function for making sure that a user is authenticated before performing a certain operation on our to-dos. So right here I'll add a new file called Auth.js, and then inside this file we'll have several steps. The first thing that we will do, we'll simply create a function, and this function is our middleware function. And then we will check whether user is logged in by checking whether a token exists. So does the token exist? If the token exists, we will verify the token. So verify the token. If it is valid, we will pass functionality to the next middleware function using the next method. Okay, so these are the 4 steps that we are going to perform, and let's start by creating a function. So right here we'll use the keyword function and the name of the function, and I'll call our function auth, and it have access to request, response, and also next. Now this is our middleware function, and a middleware function is simply a function which have access to request, response, and next. So they can manipulate the body of the request, they can send a response to the client, and they can pass functionality to the next middleware function. Okay, now right here we will check whether a token exists, and how we will do that is by reading the header of our request. So when sending a request, we will include a key and a value, where the key is like a variable of the token and the value is the token itself, and this will be at the header of the request. So we can read the token from the header of the request and store it on a constant. So right here I'll simply say const token will be equal to a request dot header, and then we will have a key called x of token. Now this is a key and it will have a value which is the token. If it doesn't, our token here will be either null or undefined. Now we can use this token to check whether it exists or not by using the if statement here. So if token does not exist, not token, we will return an error to the client. So return res.status, and we will use the status code of 41, meaning that they are not authorized to perform this request. So right here I'll say 41, and then we can send a message to the client, not authorized, and you can send your own custom message here. So we have performed this second step where we are checking whether a token exists, and the token will be available at the headers of our request. Now the next step, if this token exists, we need to verify the token, and to verify the token we need to use JSON web token module. So let's import JSON web token to this file just like this. So we'll say const JWT will be equal to require JSON web token, and then we can use this JWT to verify our token. So right here I'll use a try and catch block. So how we verify the token is by using the verify method available in JWT. So we'll say JWT.verify, and then it have two parameters. The first parameter is our token, and then the second parameter is the secret key, which we included in our environment variable, this one. Okay, so I'll come back to auth, and we need to read this secret key from this environment variable. So I'll come and create a new constant here, or rather go to signIn and copy this line, okay, where we have secret key is equals to process.env.secret key, and that will give us our secret key. So I'll just copy that, reading secret key from the environment variable, and include it here, just like that. Now this method will return the payload of our token if the token is valid. We'll store this one in a constant, and we can call this payload, and now we can attach this payload to our request. Okay, so I'll say request.user will be equal to payload. Now our payload contains the details of our user, because remember when we are signing in a user right here, we included this data in the payload. So our payload will have the ID, the name, and the email, and that basically represents our user. So we can attach an object to our request called user and set it to be our payload. And then after this, it means that we have successfully verified this token, and we can pass functionality to our next middleware function, just like that. Now, if this process fails, it means that that token is not valid, and we can use a catch block here to catch the error. So we have access to the error object, and we can send a message to the client, res.status, and I'll use the status code of 400, meaning this is a bad request, and then .send, and you send a message here, maybe invalid token. So now we are successfully checking whether a token exists, and also verifying that token. If it is valid, we pass functionality to the next middleware function, and if it is not valid, we send an error. Okay, and we are also attaching our payload data to a user object right here. Now the next thing that we need to do is to export this middleware function so that we can use it on our to-dos file. So I'll just remove these notes, and then I'll export this function at the bottom here using module.exports will be equal to auth. Now we can import our auth middleware function in our todos.js file. I'll come to to-do.js, scroll at the top, and I can import it at the top here. So I'll say const auth will be equal to require one step upwards, and then access the middleware folder, and then we access our auth file. Now once we import this auth, remember it's our function, our middleware function, we can use it on our endpoints. And how we will do that is by including it as a parameter at our get method here, or post method, in any of these CRUD operation methods. So the first parameter will be the path, the second parameter will be our middleware function. So our middleware function is executed before this callback function, and once it's executed, all this process must be valid. So we must have a token, the token must be valid, and then we pass functionality to the next middleware function, which is now our callback function, right here. If that process fails, it means that we won't proceed to getting our to-dos. Now we can test this using Postman. So I'll come to my command prompt here to make sure that server is running, and then open Postman. So the first thing that we need to have is a valid JSON web token, and we'll get that by logging in a user. So I'll perform a post request to localhost 5000 /API /signIn to log in a user, and then at the body of the request we'll have an email which is registered already and a password which is valid, and then I'll send this request. So send, and we get a token as the response here. I'll copy this token, and we need to perform a get request to this endpoint, this one here, where we have included auth middleware function here, and see whether we'll be able to access the data. Okay, so back to Postman, I will perform a get request, and we don't need anything at the body of the request, so you can ignore this or delete everything if you have anything here. And when you check at the headers here, you'll see we have key value of our headers, and it's currently empty. So when we perform this request, we should get an error because we are not authorized. Let's see. I'll send this request, and not authorized message comes in, and this is from our middleware function. So it means that it's working. Now we can set a key here, and remember we gave a key of X auth token, and the value is our token, what we just copied. Okay, so I'll paste it here, and when I perform this request, we should now get our to-dos. I will send, and perfect, we are getting an empty array. This means that we don't have to-dos currently at our database, but we are getting back something. So our token is valid. But what if I mess up with this token? Like maybe I remove the 5 and replace it with another digit. So this is not a valid token. So I will send, and we should get a different error. Invalid token. So our middleware function is working. So that is how we protect our routes. We just include this middleware function with every request. But for now, I want these routes to remain public so that we can first work on our front end, and when we get to working with authentication and authorization on the front end, we will come back and protect our routes, and we will perform a further authorization so that users only get the to-dos that they themselves have created, and also post the to-dos and edit or delete to-dos that they themselves have created and not other people's to-do. And we have access to our user right now in our request. Okay, so right here we can maybe log the request to the console, just like this. So we can say console.log, and then request.user, and this is the user that we attached to our request at the auth middleware as payload. So if I log the user to the console, just like this, request.user, we should get that data. Okay, now let's try this one out, and I'll come to Postman, and then we should have a valid token for this to work. So I will revert this where we had a 5 and it have disappeared, so I'll paste it again. Yep, now we should get a user at our console, but here we should get an empty array. I will send, so we are getting an empty array. Let's check our console, and we are getting our payload ID, name, email, and when the token was created. So we will have access to the user ID, and when creating each to do, we'll also attach a user ID. So we'll be able to perform a check whether those IDs are equal, and then perform further authorization. So that's it for this video, and in the next video we'll start now checking at React, Redux, and also Material UI.